At 41,000 feet over Canada, both engines on a brand new jet went quiet. Not one, both. The cockpit screens went black. 69 people on board, no engines, no power, and every airport too far to reach. What sent them up there with empty tanks wasn't a storm or a broken engine. It was a single number, a number that careful people checked twice and got wrong both times. And the only reason all 69 are alive today is that the man in the left seat had a hobby nobody thought mattered. This is Air Canada Flight 143, the day a passenger jet ran out of fuel in midair and had to glide to the ground. We're going to trace the exact chain of small mistakes that drain those tanks, one step at a time, and stay till the end. Because the runway they aimed for had been turned into something that should have made all of this far worse. In 1983, the Boeing 767 was brand new, and Air Canada's were the first jets the airline ran entirely in metric. Fuel measured in kilograms, not pounds. The whole country was switching to the metric system, and aviation was switching with it. But this particular aircraft had a problem. The fuel quantity gauges weren't working. A fault left the cockpit with no automatic reading of how much fuel was actually on board. On its own, that doesn't ground a plane. The rules allowed the flight, as long as the crew measured the fuel by hand before takeoff. So that's what they did. Mechanics used a dripstick, a measuring rod under the wing that tells you how many liters of fuel are in the tanks. Liters. But the plane needed to know kilograms. So someone had to convert. Take the liters in the tanks and turn them into a weight. Multiply the volume by the density of the fuel, and you get the mass. Simple arithmetic. And the captain wanted to be safe, so they ran the numbers. Then ran them again. Everyone agreed. The plane had enough fuel to cross the country. On paper, it did. Flight 143 took off, climbed to altitude, and turned west. The crew believed more than enough fuel to land with room to spare. They were wrong by half. Because buried inside that simple conversion was one wrong number, and nobody caught it. To understand how a careful crew, checking twice, still loaded half the fuel they needed, you have to look at the single number they multiplied by. Here it is. To turn liters into kilograms, you multiply by the density of jet fuel, about 0.8. 0.8. But the number that got used wasn't 0.8. It was 1.77. And 1.77 isn't kilograms per liter. It's pounds per liter. The old imperial number from the system Canada was leaving behind. With 1.77, the math looked perfect. The figures matched. The crew saw a number telling them the tanks were full enough to reach Edmonton. But that number was in the wrong units. They'd calculated the fuel in pounds and loaded it as if it were kilograms. And a kilogram is more than twice a pound. So the jet left the ground with roughly half the fuel it actually needed. Every check they ran used the same wrong number. So every check agreed. For a while, nothing happened. The 767 cruised west, smooth and silent. Then, over Red Lake, Ontario, a warning chimed. A fuel pressure problem on the left side. The crew started planning a diversion to Winnipeg. Annoying. Not dangerous. Then the left engine went silent. Minutes later, the warning they thought was impossible. The right engine died too. In that instant, the 767 lost almost all electrical power. The modern screens that told them everything went black. A small propeller, the ram air turbine, dropped into the airflow automatically, giving them just enough power to keep basic control. They were now flying 80 tons of airliner with no engines, barely any instruments, and the ground a very long way down. And here's what the manuals never planned for. There was no procedure for this. Boeing never wrote a checklist for both engines out, glide a 767 to the ground, because it wasn't supposed to be possible. What saved Flight 143 wasn't in any book. It was in the captain's spare time. Captain Bob Pearson wasn't only an airline pilot. He was an experienced glider pilot. He flew engineless aircraft for fun. He knew, in his hands, how to keep a powerless plane in the air and trade height for distance. While Pearson flew, First Officer Maurice Quintal did the math. They could not reach Winnipeg. They'd come down short. But Quintal remembered something. He'd served in the Air Force, and he knew an old military base nearby, a place called Gimli. So they turned for it. What they didn't know, the old runway at Gimli wasn't a quiet airfield anymore. It had been turned into a racetrack. And that day, it was packed. A sports car race. Families, kids, campers parked right beside the strip. Coming in, Pearson realized he was too high and too fast. And a jet with no engines can't climb away and try again. So he did something you do in a glider and never in an airliner. He crossed the controls and threw the 767 into a steep sideways slip, dumping altitude without gaining speed, dropping straight toward that crowded strip. The wheels hit. The nose gear, which hadn't locked down, folded under, and the scraping nose actually helped drag the jet to a stop just short of the people. 69 on board. Nobody killed. Nobody on the ground hurt. So what went wrong on Flight 143? Not one big thing. A broken gauge. A country caught mid-switch between two systems of measurement. One wrong number. 1.77 instead of 0.8. Trusted by careful people who all made the same mistake together. Every safeguard lined up, and every one of them failed. And the only reason it became a famous landing instead of a famous crash is that the man flying spent his weekends in engineless gliders, a skill no airline required and no checklist mentioned. They called it the Gimli glider. The aircraft was repaired and flew for another 25 years. Because at 41,000 feet, with both engines silent, the line between a tragedy and a miracle came down to a hobby, and a single number no one thought to question.